Goedenavond allemaal. Good evening everybody and welcome. Welcome. I'm Hannah Luden, CIDI's director, and I welcome you all to our virtual book launch. A special welcome to our guest, Yossi Klein HaLevi. Welcome Yossi, Baruch haba. Yossi, I will say a few words in Dutch for introduction and then we can move on to the real thing, okay? CIDI heeft al vele jaren een relatie met Yossi Klein HaLevi. Hij is een van de meest gewaardeerde sprekers bij verschillende bezoeken die we in Israël brengen. En we hebben al heel lang geprobeerd om Yossi naar Nederland te halen, om zo hem te laten kennismaken, of het Nederlandse publiek met hem kennis te laten maken en van zijn wijsheid te genieten. Toen de gelegenheid van dit boek kwam, het boek die we vandaag gaan bespreken, hebben we deze gelegenheid met de tweede handen gegrepen om dat te doen. En we zijn ook heel erg dankbaar voor de financiering die het mogelijk allemaal heeft gemaakt. En voor de mensen die dat hebben gedaan. En als het goed is, zitten ze ook in ons publiek vandaag. Maar het is natuurlijk ook een hard werk geweest voor vertalen, redigeren, controleren, editen. Voor allerlei mensen die heel hard hebben gewerkt. En natuurlijk voor de publishing en het projectmanagement van het geheel. En het boek was bijna zover. En hebben wij natuurlijk een planning moeten maken ook voor een lezing. En we hebben 19 april met Yossi kunnen afstemmen tussen alle drukke agenda's door. En toen kwam corona. En toen wisten we niet wat we moesten doen. Nou, het is uiteindelijk toch goed gekomen. En ik ben heel blij om te zeggen, om Yossi bij ons te hebben, hoewel deze keer virtueel. En ik wil een paar woorden zeggen over Yossi Klein HaLevi. Yossi, I'm going to introduce you shortly. Yossi will talk a bit about his book in a few minutes. Yossi is a senior fellow at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and he's the co-director of the Muslim Leadership Initiative program in that institute. Yossi was born in New York and immigrated, he made Aliyah, as we call it in Israel, to Israel in 1982. That's quite a while ago, and has lived there since. He has worked as a journalist for many years for different American media, such as the New Republican and the Village Voice and some others. And as I said, he's a very respected and loved speaker, not only for CIDI, but for many other opportunities. Yossi, a former board member of CIDI, has called me the other day and said, you know, I'm not a big reader, but this book, Yossi's book, I read in one day. I thought it was such a good and engaging book. And this is, I think, a compliment you deserve. So it's your writing, but it's also, of course, a compliment for the Dutch translation of the book. And I'm very happy to announce, to present you virtually, as it were, your new translation of your book. And as it says in Dutch, Brieven, mijn Palestijnse, buurman, which is an exact translation of the English title, of course. Before giving Yossi the virtual floor, I would like to let you know that you can order the book via the CIDI shop on our website. You can just order the book easily. Because of the corona and because of this happy occasion, we have decided not to charge any, what do you call it in English, any postal costs. So it's only the book that you're paying for, and it's for a good cause, of course. Yossi will start with a short introduction, and then we'll carry a conversation. And in the course of the conversation, everybody is welcome to pose any question you feel appropriate, and you can do that by using the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Yeah, well, there are, of course, many other lectures in the planning, but I will refer to them at the end of our meeting today. Yossi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannah, and good evening, everyone from Jerusalem. I would just like to first thank a few people who have really been instrumental in making the evening happen and in making the translation possible. Well, first of all, of course, Hannah and Naomi, CIDI, thank you really for bringing this book to such an audience. I'd like to thank Elise Friedman and Hilda Pach, and most of all, Thea Komers-Rosendahl, who initiated the translation, who in fact translated the book and then wrote to me saying, "You don't know me, but I've just translated your book." And so, Thea, I know you're on this call, and I just want to say how grateful I am to you for really making this possible. So the book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a series of 10 letters written to an anonymous Palestinian neighbor who lives literally on the next hill from where I'm sitting now. I can look out across and see the lights of a Palestinian village on the next hill. It's Shurfat. And we are separated by the wall, the security barrier. And so I wrote these letters with really two intentions in mind. First of all, to try to initiate a conversation, even a virtual conversation, over this wall, which has made a more intimate connection that much more elusive. And secondly, to tell something of the Jewish people's story through my own personal story, I'd say my own perspective on the Jewish story, and to try to explain to my Palestinian neighbor who we are as a people and why we're here, why we live on the hill across from them. And it occurred to me at a certain point that no one on our side in the last 100 years of conflict had ever tried to reach out and explain our story, why we believe that this is home, why we came back here, our 4,000-year story, which is virtually unknown in Palestinian society and throughout the Arab world. And the book was translated into Arabic. It came out in Arabic translation the same day that it came out in English. This goes back now 2 years. And I put it online in Arabic for free downloading and invited any Arabic speaker to read and respond. And then I waited. I waited to see what kind of responses I would get. I created a Facebook page in Arabic, a website in Arabic. And soon the letters began coming. Many of them were, as I expected, quite antagonistic, even some of them outright hateful. But there were other letters that were thoughtful, nuanced, angry, and yet still respectful. And in the new edition that came out in English, and that has now come out in Dutch, the book ends with an epilogue of these Palestinian responses. And the epilogue is letters from Palestinians to their Israeli neighbor. And I decided to end the book with those letters without responding in the book, which is to say, to give the Palestinian narrative the last word in a book that was intended to defend the Zionist narrative. And the reason that I did that was, first of all, to honor the Palestinian respondents with that last word, and also to try to create a model for a different kind of conversation. I have been writing, reporting, commenting about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for 40 years. And I am a veteran of the Palestinian-Israeli wars, the op-ed wars. And in this book, I'm looking for a new language, a new way of speaking, not only about the conflict with the Palestinians, but to the Palestinians. And we are never going to agree over the basic narratives. Palestinians and Israelis will always argue about our irreconcilable stories. We'll never agree about what happened in 1948 and why, the creation of Israel and the birth of the Palestinian tragedy. We will never agree about what happened in the Six-Day War and why. We'll never agree about which side is ultimately responsible for the collapse of the peace process in the year 2000. For that matter, we can't even agree on the latest incidents on the Gaza border. And so built into this conflict are really irreconcilable narratives. But it's precisely because of that that I felt the need to create a space in which each people can tell its story, and each side is committed, as painful as it is, to hearing the story of the other. And the reason, quite frankly, that that is a model that I feel so passionately about is because I feel a deep need for my story to be heard in the Arab world. And my story, the Jewish story, the Zionist story, is almost completely unknown, misunderstood in the Arab world. But the only way that I feel I have the right to ask Palestinians or Arabs generally to hear my story is if I'm willing to hear theirs. And so, in a sense, there's a certain trade-off here. And that's the model that I've tried to create. Now, why the emphasis on narratives? I was speaking at a forum in Washington, D.C. when the book first came out about 3 years ago with a Palestinian friend. And someone in the audience raises his hand and says, you know, the two of you are speaking about your arguments over 1948 and 1967. Why can't we just leave the past alone? And let's look at the future, a very American way of looking at reality. And my friend Huda and I both simultaneously shouted, no, there's no way that we can give up our history. We are our story. That's true for the Jewish people. And I would actually define the Jewish people as a story that we tell ourselves about who we think we are. And it's true as well for the Palestinian people. And so narrative is built into this conflict. And one of the reasons I believe that this conflict has been so difficult to solve, because the diplomats and the international community generally don't have the tools to deal with the substance of conflicting narratives. The diplomat sits at the table, looks at the problem, and tries to come up with a rational solution, a line on the map. If that were the solution, we would have reached it long ago, because we all more or less know what that line is. The problem is that this is a conflict that is not about tangibles, but fundamentally about intangibles, about the right to exist, about memory, history, trauma, the right to define oneself as a people, as a nation. One of the great sources of misunderstanding in the Arab world about the Jewish people is this sense of relating to us as a religion and not as a people. And so what I try to explain to my neighbor in the book is that the Jews are a people with a particular religious identity. But because peoplehood is so fundamental to our self-understanding, you have the strange anomaly of the Jewish atheist. which is a phenomenon that you don't have in Christianity or in Islam. As soon as you're an atheist, you're no longer part of the framework. In Judaism, because peoplehood is the foundation of our identity, you can be an atheist and still be you in reasonably good standing, depending who you ask. But nevertheless, no one will deny that an atheist is a part of the Jewish people. And so, in the end, what I've really tried to do here is break the mold of the forum of debate, and we all know what that debate sounds like, and to invite my neighbor to listen to my story and to tell me their story. Maybe I'll just conclude with one or two observations, Chana, and then we'll open up. So the book is written very much from the perspective of someone who comes from the center of the Israeli political map. And the center is the least understood place in Israeli politics, certainly by people abroad. The perception abroad is that Israel is a society that's divided between the right and the left, which of course we were for many years, but that's no longer true of Israeli politics. The Israeli left has virtually disappeared. And instead what we have is the right versus the center. And I come out of the center. I have been a passionate centrist for many decades. And the Blue and White Party, which emerged as the second largest party in the last election, as many of you know, we've had no less than 3 elections in the last year. Blue and White has emerged as the most credible threat to the Likud, even though in the last couple of weeks we've seen a disintegration of the center, but that's another story. And so the sensibility of the left is really a combination of left and right. And in the case of this book, when I say that I am coming from a centrist perspective, what I mean is that on the one hand, I'm bringing the empathy of the left to the Palestinian tragedy. I'm reaching out to my neighbor. I want to hear the Palestinian narrative. That is, quote, a left-wing Israeli perspective. And at the same time, I am unapologetic about the Zionist story. I love my story. I stand firmly within my people's story. And I also have very deep misgivings and a deep trust of the intentions of the Palestinian leadership, whether the Palestinian leadership truly is ready to accept the legitimacy of Israel in any borders. That makes me, quote, right-wing. And so a centrist is someone who has both a left-wing and a right-wing sensibility. And we represent probably close to half, if not more, I believe, of the Israeli public today. And the final point that I'll mention is that the book trying to present what I would call a 21st century perspective on Zionism. We as a people are still largely telling a 20th century story. And the 20th century story of Zionism is Eurocentric. It begins with the pogroms in Tsarist Russia, and it culminates in the Holocaust. And that's very much a story of the Zionism of need, the Zionism of refuge. The problem with that 20th century Zionist story is, first of all, that it excludes the majority of Israelis who happen not to come from Europe. A majority of Israelis today come from families that left one part of the Middle East and settled in another part of the Middle East. And their story is not about pogroms in Russia. There were pogroms in Iraq and Libya and Yemen and elsewhere in the Arab world, but it's not the European story that we're still telling. And the other problem that I feel with the Eurocentric 20th century version of Zionism is that we do ourselves an enormous disservice by locating a story which is increasingly Middle Eastern into Europe. And what we do, and the reason I say that's a deep disservice, is that we allow the enemies of Israel to come back at us and say, well, why should the Palestinians have paid the price for what Europe did to the Jews? And my response to that is that Zionism is not only about what happened to the Jews in Europe. Zionism is not only about refuge. Zionism is also about longing. And my definition of Zionism is that it was the meeting point between need, necessity, and 2,000 years of longing. And so the story that this book tries to tell places Israel very firmly in a Middle Eastern context, in a 21st century context. And in that sense, too, I'm hoping to change something of the context of the conversation.
Well, where do you start such a big issue? Maybe we should go back to what you said about Judaism as a peoplehood. I think it's not only the Muslim people who are confused about this this notion of a religion and a peoplehood. I think it's also a European question. I believe in Europe, many people don't understand. So maybe it's a good idea to elaborate a little bit more on that issue and the question of how do you explain to people that you can be Jewish but not religious, whatever that may be?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a religious Jew, and so for me, a relationship with God, with ritual, is central to my Jewish self-understanding. But my Judaism is broad enough to include those who have absolutely no interest in a religious life. And my understanding of how Judaism works, as opposed to Christianity and Islam, is that Christianity and Islam are universal faiths. And that means that the endpoint, traditionally, of both Christianity and Islam was the vision of the whole world ultimately becoming either Christian or Muslim. Judaism never worked that way. Judaism's goal was never to transform the world into its exact image, but to serve as a kind of catalyst through history, to change the course of history, to place certain ideas of what this world is and how reality works into human consciousness. And so because of that, Judaism is a particularist faith that was intended to be for a particular people that would carry its message. Now, of course, one can convert to Judaism. My wife is a convert to Judaism. But when you convert to Judaism, you're not just converting to the religion. More deeply, you are entering into the historical experience of the people. And no other religion works that way. And so that's why in an internal Jewish self-understanding, the return to Zion, national sovereignty, a state, a Jewish state, makes perfect sense in terms of our identity. But from the outside, it can be very confusing. Wait a minute, you're a religion, you're a state, you're a people. What are you? And the answer, of course, is yes. We are all those things.
Yes, and I noticed that this is one of the things which are very difficult to explain here in Europe, here in Holland, for example. And that's why I think it's important to make people understand that. But you were also talking about the central role of Israel in a physical sense in your book, not only the spiritual or religious sense and the longing, as you called it just now, but also the physical sense of the world. And yet, of the word. And yet, I want to bring two examples. You're telling about your father, who is a Holocaust survivor and who decided to immigrate to the US and not to Israel. Mm-hmm. But I also want to take another example, which goes much longer back, and this is the Jewish thinker Ahad Ha'am, who saw Israel certainly not as a physical location for the Jewish people, but more as a spiritual center of the Jewish people. How does that, how
Right.
would you refer to these two elements?
Well, I'm a very passionate Ahad Ha'am Zionist, but I think that he was wrong in terms of his timing. Ahad Ha'am famously debated Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, and felt that Herzl was somehow cheapening Jewish history and Judaism by reducing things to this very physical concept of a state. The problem is that the Jewish people desperately needed a state. And I would argue that we needed a state not only for the Jews of Europe, but if you see the disintegration of the Middle East that we've experienced, especially in the last decade or so, imagine if there was no Israel and we had several million Jews living in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. We would be in a state of emergency. It would be a historic disaster for the Jewish people. So Israel saved Jewish communities from all around the world. And Herzl was right. Before you can get to the Ahad Ha'am agenda of spiritual renewal of the Jewish people, you needed to physically protect the Jewish people. But now I believe we should be at the stage that Ahad Ha'am envisioned. Now that Israel is the largest Jewish community in the world, we now have close to 7 million Jews. We have 1 million more Jews than the second largest Jewish community, which is the United States. When I moved to Israel in 1982, there were barely 4 million people in this country. Today there are 9 million. And so Israel is an extraordinary success, far beyond anything I think that Herzl envisioned. And now we need something of the spirit of Ahad Ha'am to animate the structure that we've been given.
And the second part of my question?
About Jews moving to other countries?
Moving and living and, building their own cultures in other countries and own centers in other countries.
I am a passionate Zionist and a passionate diasporist at the same time. And I believe that what makes us a truly great people is the very interesting and ambiguous Hebrew term, Am Olam. Am Olam means two things. It means the eternal people, and we really see the miracle of Jewish survival as a kind of approximation of eternity. We are eternity within history. And even secular Jews resonate with this language of the miraculous when it comes to describing Jewish survival. But Am Olam also means something else. It means literally the people of the world. And so the fact that we as a people have lived for far longer outside the borders of the land of Israel than we did within the land of Israel, let alone the brief periods that we enjoyed national sovereignty. We take for granted now 70 years of Israeli sovereignty, but that's very rare in Jewish history. And so I cherish the expansiveness that being a world people gives us, the fact that we have filtered the experience of humanity through a Jewish lens, through all of the different communities and our interactions with the cultures that we live among. And at the same time, the fact that we have now recreated our national center, for me, this is an extraordinary moment in Jewish history, maybe the most interesting that we've ever had.
I would like us to move to the backbone of your book, and this is the conversation dialogue that you're trying to start with our Palestinian neighbors and maybe with the Arab world in general. we've got some questions about this. For example, shouldn't the book be sent to Muslim religious leaders over the whole world? And what do you expect? And on the other hand, the question which poses exactly the other one says Palestinians are a young nation, not as old as the existence of Muslims in the area and in the Holy Land itself.
Well, the book has gotten around the Arab world. I get letters from religious leaders in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, bloggers in Egypt, Syrian refugees in Europe, very moving letters. And I recently got an email from a Saudi sheikh, a religious leader, who wrote to me saying, I never realized that Jews today are descendants of the ancient Hebrews, so of course you're indigenous to this region. And the kind of things that we take for granted are not necessarily understood in the Arab world. Saudi Arabia's leading news weekly, Al Majalla, gave the book a 2-page, very positive review. Now that's never happened before in the Arab world. For an Arab publication, let alone a Saudi publication, responding positively to a book. So yes, of course I would like to see the book out there in the Arab world to a greater extent. I'm doing what I can. I have a couple of people, young Palestinians who are working with me in getting this out. And as we say in the Middle East, inshallah, God willing, this will spread.
If I understand well, the main message of your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, wait, maybe it's a good moment to ask you to read some paragraph of the book itself, to give us a taste of the book itself. Is that a good idea?
Sure. So why don't I read the first couple paragraphs just to give the audience some idea of what the rhythm of this book, at least what it sounds like in English. Dear neighbor, I call you neighbor because I don't know your name or anything personal about you. Given our circumstances, neighbor may be too casual a word to describe our relationship. We are intruders in each other's dreams, violators of each other's sense of home. We are living incarnation of each other's worst historical nightmare. Neighbors. But I don't know how else to address you. I once believed that we would actually meet, and I am writing to you now with the hope that we still might. I imagine you in your house somewhere on the next hill, just beyond my porch. We don't know each other, but our lives are entwined. And so, neighbor. From my apartment, I can just barely see the checkpoint you must cross, if you have a permit at all, to enter Jerusalem. But I sense the checkpoint's all-pervading presence. Sometimes my early morning routine of meditation and prayer is disrupted by the prolonged honking of frustrated drivers lining up before the checkpoint. Maybe you too have been caught in that desperate line. It is just before dawn as I write. I am in my study facing your hill. The muezzin calls softly as if reluctant to disturb the night. I wrap myself in a white prayer shawl and sit cross-legged on a meditation pillow. I touch my forehead to the ground, a nod to the call to prayer coming from across the way. In my most intimate conversation with God, I am hoping to speak to you. Now, when I began the book saying I call you neighbor because I don't know your name, my hope was that I would elicit a response from Palestinians, and then I would actually get to know the names of my neighbor. And one of the great blessings for me of this book is that that's exactly what's happening. I now have Palestinian friends. I would not be able to write the book in that way anymore, because I do know the names and stories of increasing numbers of my neighbors. So that this book has really brought me into a relationship into relationships that have immeasurably enriched my life.
And yet, if you look at the Palestinian letters, I think half of them are not signed by name. Do you think?
Yes, yes. And I think that's a very important point. There is great fear on the part of Palestinians who engage with Israelis. The stigma of being a normalizer can actually be dangerous in Palestinian society. We have the case of a Palestinian in Gaza who was arrested by Hamas last week for the crime of speaking to Israelis via Zoom. What we're doing now is a crime in Gaza if there are Israelis involved in the conversation. And so one of the most painful things for me was seeing the fear of Palestinians who had the courage and the goodwill to engage with me. Look, the book was translated by a young Palestinian man who couldn't put his name to the translation. And this is a young man of 30. This is his first published book. And he was so proud of it. And the Arabic is beautiful. He did a magnificent job. And yet he was afraid to be associated with the book. And so that also tells us something significant about this conflict and about what we're up against.
Do you think this tendency is also growing in the Israeli society, or do you think it's something you only see at the Palestinians?
Very much. Very much on the Israeli side as well. The younger you go in both societies, the more bitterness and despair you'll find. Our generation, Chana, we were the Israelis of hope. We were the Israelis of the Oslo years. The Israelis who thought maybe something can change. My kids are the generation who grew up after the peace collapsed. And so in my generation, when we would say, give peace a chance, it would resonate. In this generation, when you say, give peace a chance, they say, well, we gave peace more than a chance. And what we got back were 4 years of suicide bombings and years of rocket attacks from Gaza. And so there is bitterness, and where there is bitterness and despair, there's hatred. And I am worried, desperately worried, about growing hatred in both societies.
Yossi, your main message in the book is we probably will never accept each other's narratives, but we must know those narratives and recognize that they exist and that they are real for both people.
Yes.
And the second point of your book, if I may, is that this should lead us both to the understanding that we have to compromise, which means sometimes very difficult compromise to make, but that means dividing the city into the place, this holy land, into two states. Is this correct?
Yes, very much.
Do you think you would have written a different book now that you really met people and talked to people? And with these 2 points...
It's a very good question, Chana. You know, until the second intifada of the early 2000s, I had extensive connections in Palestinian society. I wrote a book that came out in 2001 called At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, which told the story of my journey as a religious Jew into Palestinian Islam and Christianity. That journey ended with the second intifada. Like most Israelis, I recoiled in anger, in frustration, I felt that Israel really had tried to end the occupation, both at Camp David in the year 2000 and then accepting the Clinton proposals, and then Ehud Olmert's peace plan, Prime Minister Olmert in 2008. And every Israeli initiative was rejected, and not just rejected, but rejected violently. And so I was very much a normative, angry, frustrated Israeli. So it's not that I didn't know Palestinians before I wrote this book, but I had, like most Israelis, I had withdrawn into my Israeli shell and didn't want to engage with Palestinians. I didn't want to hear about the occupation. Anytime the occupation came up, my response was, it could have been different. We made offers on the table, and the question should be addressed to Palestinian leaders and not to my side. But you know, it's been 10 years since Israel has made a credible offer to the Palestinians. And honestly, if we made a credible offer today, I don't believe the Palestinian leadership would accept an offer that Israelis like myself can live with. I still think the two sides are too far apart. That doesn't absolve us from the need to continue trying to put an offer on the table, but even more importantly, to refrain from expanding settlements, to refrain from precluding the possibility in the future of a two-state solution. So I wrote this book partly for us as well, and the book is coming out in Hebrew soon. And my hope is to start a conversation here among Israelis about how do we envision the future. And again, I'm not coming from a left-wing Israeli perspective. I'm not coming from a peace now point of view. I don't believe that peace now is possible, but I do very much believe in the urgency of asking ourselves some hard questions and holding ourselves accountable for not making it impossible to someday reach a solution. And our government today is leading us toward a one-state disaster. And that's something that I feel we need to.
And how does the Trump plan suit into this equation?
The Trump plan might have been an interesting starting point had it been presented as the basis for an interim agreement rather than a final status. It isn't anywhere near adequate for a viable Palestinian state. But as an interim agreement, even a long-term interim agreement, it could have been a way of moving us from the dead end where we are now to that point. At the same time, I think that the Trump plan is a necessary wake-up call for Palestinian leaders. Because if you look at the pattern of the history of peacemaking, going back almost 100 years to the 1930s, to the Peel Commission report, and then UN partition, and that whole pattern of plans that are put on the table. Every time there's a plan suggested and the Palestinian leadership has said no, the next plan that's put on the table offers the Palestinians a smaller map. Until we come to the Trump plan, where the map has shrunk to just about as small as it can. And so the message, I think, for Palestinian leaders is that time is not necessarily on the side of the Palestinian national movement. And maybe it's time to not just say no, but give us an idea of what your plan is. Give us a detailed plan after 100 years of conflict of what do you intend to do about refugees? Which are the settlements that will go? Which are the settlements that you're ready to keep in place in exchange for land from pre-1967 Israel? Give us a plan. Because when I attack my government or its intransigence, and I believe my government deserves to be attacked, the response that I get from the Israeli right is, well, where's your partner? Where's their peace plan? And it's a legitimate rejoinder.
that doesn't leave us with much hope. I want to refer to two other books which are discussing the same issue. And I will start with the book of Neighbour. I don't know if it was translated into English, but it's called something like The Land Behind the Hills or The Land Behind the Mountains. Eretz Me'ever leharim, it's called in Hebrew. And he also took the pain of traveling to Palestinian areas and talked to Palestinians. And his conclusion is not the same as yours. Do you know the book?
Yeah, I didn't read it. He doesn't believe that a two-state solution is possible anymore.
And what do you think about that?
Look, I think that if it were up to Israel and the Palestinians, I would agree with him. After 20 years or more since the Oslo process, both sides know each other intimately. We know each other's red lines. Amos Oz, the late Israeli writer, once said, the problem isn't that we don't know each other's demands. The problem is that we do. and so if it's left up to the two sides, then I agree there's no hope. But if you expand the lens to include the Middle East, then something very significant has happened in the last few years. And I'm speaking, of course, about the rise of Iran and the fear in the Sunni world of an imperial Iran. And that has brought Iran closer together, has brought the Sunni world closer together with Israel in an anti-Iranian strategic alliance. This is something we've never experienced before. If the Saudi media is relating to a book by an Israeli author, it's because of this concern for Iran. And so my hope is that the trade-off that we might envision would be peace between Israel and the Arab world in exchange for a Palestinian state, in which the Arab world would offer Israel full normalization and be involved with us in the economic development of a Palestinian state, and perhaps even in security arrangements, on the Temple Mount and other issues. And that might help neutralize some of the Palestinian opposition, because I don't believe that the Palestinian national movement is willing or able to reach the compromise with Israel that a majority of Israelis can live with. But if we go through the Arab world, we might be able, given this new strategic relationship, certain possibilities may be opening that were inconceivable.
So the hope is leadership from other Arab countries.
Yes, along with an Israeli leadership that is able to transcend our understandable wariness and look for opportunities, because those opportunities, I think, are presenting themselves.
Well, it gives us at least some hope. Maybe it's interesting to discuss this matter in a more extensive way, but I'm afraid we're having a problem. Our time is almost finished. I think I would like to use one last question from the questions I saw here. I think most of the questions that were posed were answered, but maybe this very straightforward question about, do you think there are enough Israelis and enough Palestinians to support your vision of a solution?
Look, I know Israeli society much better, more intimately than I know Palestinian society. On the Israeli side, my response is, at this moment in time, no. But what we've seen time and again in Israeli politics is that what was inconceivable one moment becomes inevitable the next. And I'm thinking, for example, of Anwar Sadat's visit to Israel. The day before Sadat got on a plane for Israel, the notion that the Israeli public would support a withdrawal from Sinai, where we had fought 3 wars, was inconceivable. There was no demographic problem in Sinai. There was no occupation of another people. And yet Sadat comes to Israel, and literally overnight, 80% of Israelis support withdrawal to the last centimeter from Sinai. Rabin shaking Yasser Arafat's hand. Inconceivable until the moment he did it. And then at least initially, a majority of Israelis being willing to give that ill-fated process a chance. And so I think that it depends on the circumstances. If we were to see a credible Palestinian leader emerge who would say, we accept the indigenousness of the Jewish people, your legitimacy as a nation in this region. And for me, and I think for most Israelis, the key words are legitimacy and indigenousness. The key word, and this is something Europeans do not understand, the key word is not peace, because peace is a very ambiguous term. I want to know that the Arab world is ready for peace with a Jewish majority state in the equation. Because peace, yes, peace without an Israel. And when Palestinian leaders say peace, what I hear is peace, but ultimately a Jewish majority state will, one way or another, disappear. Either through demographic change, through the refugees returning, or through violence, or whatever way. I need to hear legitimacy and indigenousness. If we hear that from Palestinian leaders, then I believe we will have a majority of Israelis ready for the painful concessions. Yes. On the Palestinian side, do I believe there's potentially a majority for peace? I don't see the evidence of that. What I would say is there is a minority, maybe even a strong minority of Palestinians who would be willing to accept a Jewish majority state. Is that good news or bad news? Well, it depends which way you're looking at it. The good news is that I believe there are many Palestinians who are sick enough of this conflict that they would be ready for that compromise. The less good news is that I don't see the evidence of there being a Palestinian majority. And by evidence, I mean the polls. I look at the polls. And even when Palestinians say, yeah, we're in favor of a two-state solution, if you probe a little more deeply, a two-state solution is usually seen as a prelude or as an interim stage to a one-state solution, which will be Palestine from the river to the sea.
So it's not even a question of leadership.
Well, it is a question of leadership because one of the reasons that I believe we don't have a greater Palestinian willingness to come to terms with Israel is because the message that they're getting day and night from their political leadership, from their media, in their schools, is that the Jews are not a real people. We have no historical roots in this land. We have no right to be here. We're thieves. And one day we're going to leave here, just like all of the other colonialists have before. So that's the obstacle that we need to overcome. And I wrote my book in part to try to address exactly that problem.
That point. Well, unfortunately, Yossi, we have to wrap up. I have so many more questions. I think I could talk for 2 hours at least, but maybe it's a good thing about the book. The book has so many more details, viewpoints, arguments, insights. I really think I loved reading it, and I hope other people will do too. But maybe we should schedule a new meeting. But for now, I really have to wrap up, and I want to say a few things. I think I want to say a few things. Today is not just 19th of April. 19th of April for me, growing up in a house with a father who was born and bred in Warsaw, is a very special day. It's the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And of course, in Israel, we commemorate it on the Jewish date. Not exactly, because that many years ago, in 1943, it was the eve of Pesach. This year, we're going to commemorate it on the 21st, which is 2 days from now. And actually, the commemoration will start tomorrow evening. And I would like to draw people's attention to this fact, The 21st is Yom HaShoah in Israel. And if anybody wants to join any of the things happening around this day, and there are very interesting things happening, I want to point the website of Yad Vashem with many interesting activities and with a central ceremony happening the 21st. Also, there will be a ceremony on the 21st in the evening here in the Netherlands, online again, and you can follow that too. But another event related to the question of Holocaust and genocide in general is a lecture we are organizing coming Thursday. This will be in Dutch, Yossi, so I don't invite you, but it will be carried out by Professor Ugur Umit Ungor, and he will talk about a comparison of different genocides and how to remember them. And I think it's going to be very interesting. And in light of the news in the Netherlands about how we discuss the Srebrenica affair, I think it's going to be even more relevant. But also, I want to point out some other events, which I'm not going to point out in details. Tonight, there will be a lecture at the NEIS about the Yom HaAtzmaut, which will be celebrated in Israel the week after coming week, on the 28th and 29th of April. Again, according to the Jewish calendar, it's Hei B'Iyar. And we are also organizing some events around this that you can find on our website, including a lecture on the 29th. But tonight, Harav Aviad Tavori will give a lecture about Yom HaAtzmaut in English, and I think it's going to be very interesting too. I must finish now before this session is really turning black, and I want to thank Yossi very, very much for your for our conversation and for the book.
Your pleasure. Thank you.
And I think I would want to suggest that we schedule a new meeting to discuss some of the details we have just touched upon in a second meeting. Thank you very much. Have a very good day and a very good week to us all.
Take care, everyone.